Okay. Welcome, everyone. We're here for our We Vote for Sensible Gun Laws coffee chat. It's the hardest call of our series because it is so sad what is continually going on. And I was really upset last week when there was yet another senseless school shooting. So I'm glad that we're coming together today to have this conversation. And I just want to share that this is a part of our Why Do You Vote social action campaign. And we're trying to talk about 7 issues that most Americans agree on. And sensible gun laws is one of them. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit campaign, and over 83% of Americans want background checks for gun sales. So by talking about this, coming together, having a conversation, the ideas of these Tuesday coffee chats is to connect, engage, and empower. So by bringing new people together, we can hopefully move the needle on this. And I really appreciate you coming for this talk. And I want to share our collective spreadsheet where people can put resources. I have resources from our past calls, and then I have links to the people on our calls today. And so to start it off, I would like to welcome Abbey Clements from Teachers Unify to End Gun Violence.
Thank you so much for having me, Holly. It's been nice to meet you and to see all the interesting things that you do, and in particular that you host these important conversations, because we know for cultural change that it's about one person at a time. It's really about those connections that we make with people, and when you break down all the barriers that somehow are contrived between us, maybe, then you find out that there isn't really much difference in what you want, and what you hope for. Um, so in preparation for this call, I just want to make sure I'm on the right page here. We talked about sort of going through where we came from, where we are now, and some of the things that we would like to see and that we care about in terms of gun violence prevention, right? Um, so I was a teacher for 32 years, and I think about like the before me, before being impacted so deeply by the school shooting, where I was a second grade teacher at Sandy Hook School in Newtown, Connecticut. And the before me, I was a mom and a teacher, and I loved having summers off with my kids. I always voted. I went to protests in my 20s. And I was like, I would call myself like aware, didn't wasn't an activist in terms of making phone calls or writing postcards or standing on a corner necessarily, in most of my adult life as a teacher, but um, always voted. And I mean, in terms of this issue, as aware what was happening. I grew up in New York City in the 80s, and um, you know, uh, back then, I think that the understanding was like you just don't go into certain neighborhoods, which is awful to think of gun violence that way. But we know that gun violence is indiscriminately affects communities. Of course, impacted by some communities more than others on a day-to-day basis, which is awful. But I was like a before me. I was pretty much a rule follower. I think as an elementary school teacher, I like follow directions and follow the rules. Didn't really make a lot of waves if I didn't agree with something. Um, but always felt like my values were in place. And then there's just like what happens when a system so big, like a school system in a small town, when a tragedy like that, in that of that enormity impacts a town, a school district, a school, it just it changes you. It changes your DNA to have 19 kids who you in your responsibility to take care of them and to keep them safe. And you had little control or no control over what was happening at a terrifying time. The perpetrator shot through our school and turned left, and I was the second door on the right. And I remember therapists saying to me, like, when did you know that you were safe and that it was over? And it's never been over. I completely changed that day and dedicated my life outside of teaching and my family to trying to help make change, which I know is an upward battle in a country with more guns than people. So I know the challenges. And I knew them then. You know, my daughter was 16 at the time, and she was in lockdown at the high school in Newtown High School in physics class, and didn't know for a moment if I was okay. And she became really the activist in the family. She too changed overnight, always very interested in politics, but she wanted to be a filmmaker. And the change happened so fast for her, she didn't even recognize it. She could barely recognize herself changing so fast. And, you know, we let her go and do all these things when you just, after a tragedy like that, I just wanted everybody to stay in one place. But I I carry with me the weight of this tremendous survivor guilt. And that, I don't know how else to say it, it weighs heavily on me. It just always has from the moment afterwards. And that what came with that for me and what it looks like is just like a tremendous responsibility to try to do something. And I know my students then, who are now, most of them are in their second year of college, and I have this, one of the greatest privileges of my life is being in touch with them and being able to watch them grow up. And I know that, and gun violence is so prevalent that this is not always the case. So I take it very seriously. I've been an advocate for almost a decade, mostly with Moms Demand Action, which I loved. But what was missing was like organizing teachers while I was working with Moms Demand Action. I loved it. There are so many different roles you could take. You learn new things. You step out of your comfort zone. You can try to do things that like, or you could just like do what you like and like be in your, you know, pajamas and write postcards and or text people to get out the vote. Like, you don't have to get out of your comfort zone. So there's something for everyone in that organization, and I loved it. But again, like I was like, God, what about the teachers? Like, we never hear from them. They're not speaking out. And I know it's hard to speak out, especially when you have students and you know, there were so many impacted, and there are layers of impact, and then the guilt between the layers, and it's just so difficult. But it was always a concern for me, and I was like waiting for a national organization to set up a teacher arm of theirs, and waiting, and I would talk to people and be like, why don't you guys start a teacher arm? Or what about the teachers? There are like so many of us, and like we're doing these heinous drills. The school shootings aren't stopping. Guns are the leading cause of death for children in America. Like, why is there no teacher organization? So after yet another school shooting, this time in Oxford, Michigan, two other educator and activist and survivor friends of mine, one of them whom is a survivor of the Parkland tragedy, the other is a New York City activist. Among us, we have 75 plus teaching years that we've been teaching. And I asked them, if you want to start a national organization for teachers by teachers, and they didn't skip a beat and said yes. That was almost 3 years ago. So Teachers Unified to End Gun Violence, were about 15,000 educators, librarians, supporters, allies, parents, who are just worried about teachers and kids and their grandkids, and they're fed up and they want to be a part of something. We consider ourselves the bridge, um, connecting the gun violence prevention movement and the education space, who we really feel needs to ramp up their efforts on gun violence prevention. And that starts with listening, and it starts with raising the voices of educators who, are dealing with gun violence on a daily basis, whether it visits their school or not. It's in the communities where their schools are, and it's in families of kids in their classrooms. So, we're late in providing teachers resources on what to do and how to talk to kids about gun violence, how to help kids who have been impacted by gun violence. So that's one of the things we do, is we provide resources. We have a podcast to help elevate the voices of those who've been impacted and those who are afraid and those who are fed up. And we attend many education conferences. And I laugh because I don't know why I laugh. I'm angry that the education space is not where it should be on this issue, but we're just going to keep pushing the bar by begging to attend and asking to provide a panel or a workshop on this issue. So that's what Teachers Unified does. I want to put in the chat one of my favorite things that we're working on right now, which is a link that you all can bring back to your friends, your communities, and anybody who's, excuse me, in gun violence, it has a child in school, or like there's a school that you're connected with somehow. Maybe you have a family member who's a teacher or works in a school. And this link can provide you with a letter that you can edit to encourage the school leader, principal, superintendent to send out a safe firearm letter to all their families. We're working on normalizing safe storage because we really feel like safe storage is a cultural, nonpartisan piece of the puzzle here. We know that too many guns are left, as we know last week, available for children, and that half of gun owners leave at least one gun unsecured and locked. So I love this safe storage letter. And last thing I'll say before I pass it on is that we were integral in helping New York City schools get their safe storage firearm letter out to 1 million families at the beginning of the school year. And we'll keep working on that. So I don't know if you're doing questions now or later, but thank you so much for allowing me to talk about Teachers Unify.
Thank you, Abby. What you're doing is amazing, and I'm so glad you had the insight to start the collective voice of the teachers. And we're gonna, go through all of our featured guests before we go to Q&A. Since we're talking about schools, I thought we'd next have Kimberly Rubio share your experience and what you've been doing since this tragedy hit your community. And, one thing that breaks my heart with gun violence is we've seen the disparity when it's communities of color. And I thank Abby for talking about how she used to see gun violence before and after. And I think this is an important thing for all of us to come together and speak up when we see it affecting others in a disproportionate way. And so I'm really happy that we can talk about that openly on this call and support each other in solidarity, because every life is equally valuable. And there's, it should. Anyway, so with that, I will welcome Kimberly.
My name is Kimberly Rubio. My daughter, Lexi Rubio, is a victim of the Robb Elementary School shooting that occurred on May 24th, 2022 in Uvalde. 3 days before we buried Lexi, we testified before Congress to call for an assault weapons ban, or for progress in the form of raising the age to purchase these weapons from 18 to 21, red flag laws, stronger background checks, and to repeal gun manufacturers' liability immunity. I have been pushing for this at the federal and state level ever since. I have also co-founded Lives Robbed, a nonprofit organization with the mission to end gun violence. I did this along with three other women who have been impacted by gun violence. Specifically, they lost children in the Uvalde shooting. Under the Biden-Harris administration, we have seen progress. We've seen the development of the first ever White House Office of Gun Violence, as well as the bipartisan Safer Communities Act. But we need more. And when lives are on the line, we don't have time. Time is not on our side. Lexi, at only 10, was interested in American politics, specifically women in leadership positions. She looked up to women like AOC and Kamala Harris. I remember where we were when we found out Biden had defeated Trump. I posted a photo of my girls walking alongside the river, and I captioned it, "The future is female." I look forward to visiting Lexi's final resting place in November and letting her know that Harris is now president of the United States, and I will do my best to ensure that happens. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kimberly. I know I am so sorry for your personal loss, and I really thank you for sharing this publicly over and over and being such a leader in this change and working together to get there. Tarria, I would like to have you come on next.
Hi,
Tarria
everyone.
Stanley's with Community Justice. Sorry.
Hi, everyone. I'm appreciative of being here with you all today. My name is Tarria Stanley, and as Holly mentioned, I am the advocacy manager with Community Justice. And Community Justice, as a survivor-led organization, and we are working to change the conversation around gun violence by advocating for policy changes at the local level, but also at federal levels that focus on community and coalition building. I know that it was discussed before, but Community Justice is the first and only national gun violence prevention organization that focuses specifically on the Black and Brown communities closest to the tragedies. And we make sure that we are centering not only Black and Brown voices, but also the voices of survivors. Because we understand in order to fully tackle the issue of gun violence, survivors have to be centered in this conversation. Their stories, their voices, their needs have to be centered in this conversation. And we also understand that although change starts at the top with our leaders, it really begins in our communities. It begins with coalition building and partnership building. It begins pouring in the the necessary resources into our communities. It begins with, like I said, building coalition and in partnership. We are like nationally, we are building a diverse coalition of leaders and organizations that can carry the weight of working to end gun violence that has been present for way too long at this point. And unfortunately, way too many of us are familiar with gun violence personally. And if we may not be familiar with it personally, we see it constantly in the news. We see it constantly around us. And that just continues to present trauma in our communities, which then also causes more gun violence to happen. And we understand that coalition building and partnership is an essential component of building power in communities to, especially communities of color, to end gun violence. But I think that the main policy push from us is resources, it's funding. This work can't happen unless we have the backing of, our political leaders. If we don't have them respecting the work that a lot of these organizations on the ground do. Once tragedy happens, they're the ones in these communities doing the work. They're speaking to families. They're going into these schools. They're dealing with, the tragedies up close and personal. So they need the funding. We need mental health services in schools, right? And in our communities. We need youth programs, right? These are the sort of things that we are pushing for across the country. And another big one is Office of Gun Violence Prevention. right? Statewide offices, local offices, those sort of things, because they sort of work as a bridge between communities and policymakers. And we also operate as a bridge between communities and policymakers. That's one of the things that we make sure that we keep in the back of our minds when we're doing the work. So I just really encourage everyone to make sure that like this conversation doesn't end here, right? This conversation continues and you take it to everyone you know, family, friends, communities alike, because that is how we really get power behind the work that we're doing. That is how we build strength in numbers, and that's how we're really going to tackle gun violence is if we get everyone on board with tackling this issue correctly.
Thank you, Tarria. And I'm sharing again the shared document so that people can get to your organization and donate. Funding is critical, otherwise this work can't happen. I'm also sharing in the chat the link to community justice. One thing we like to talk about here is the intersectionality of issues. And just like you said, you know, we're focusing on 7 issues, and one of them is healthcare. And you talked about the mental health care. I mean, facing these tragedies is a lifetime trauma. Every time this affects you, you know, it triggers. So we really need to get mental health care, comprehensive mental health care, regular health care for everybody. And we also talk about voting. Next week, we're having an issue on voting. And as this does disproportionately affect communities of color, the gun violence, also voting rights being questioned and taken away. Next week, we're having 2 women that were on the Pettus Bridge, along with Greg Palast, who's done great research currently in Georgia. And it's like, if you are not having your voice and your vote counted, we're not going to get the changes. That's why we want to talk about this in an intersectional way about how can we create the future that we all believe in. Actually, most Americans believe in all of this stuff. So bringing them all together and collaborating across issues and supporting each other. And before we open up to Q&A, we still have Zanata, but she's running late from her work. But I would welcome anybody who's on the call. You know, this is community building, connecting. So before we go to Q&A, if anybody's on the call and wants to share what brought them here or their insights. I know we also have Mark Carlin, who previously presented and has been doing work on this since the 80s. But I'd welcome anybody who would like to connect before we go into the Q&A part. And if not, I know
I
it's
think I'll interject. I think it's very important to remind everybody and your networks to vote down ballot, because that makes a big difference in finally, hopefully, getting these initiatives passed to help support sensible gun laws.
Thank you, Nancy. So true. Finding who on the ballot is a real champion for change. So people can share questions in the chat now, or they can raise their hand. Let's see. We have a lot of people on today's call, so I'm trying to scroll through. I mean, I know I first did citizen lobbying on this issue. I went with a women's group and we went to speak. And I realized how many people I knew that had been directly affected by gun violence. And that's why I wanted to bring this in, you know, whether it was a domestic abuse partner who had a restraining order and still killed my friend's sister, or my friend's father who was killed at an ATM, or, you know, how many times have been near a lockdown. You know, the SMC shooting was, you know, within a mile of my house. Just how many times you get that call, it really, you get that chill in your gut whenever this happens. And how can we support each other through, you know, this isn't happening in other countries. So I'd love to also focus on, yeah, empowering all the solutions. And I know, okay, Mark, you have your hand up, so please share.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that most of these school shootings are done by individuals that have mental health problems. And so I think it's very important when you think about gun control, and we're doing this in Illinois, to simultaneously think about red flag laws, but also the provision of mental illness to increase that. We have a shortage of mental illness providers, and also we're a country that generally looks down on mental illness as some sort of weakness. And so there's a kind of national psychological transformation that needs to occur. But I'll just close by saying that it's important to understand, particularly in the school shootings, the importance of mental health treatment.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, and also the shift with how police officers deal with mental health. I've been within a mile of a police officer shooting somebody who was unhoused, and the person had a box cutter, and the other person was unarmed. And now they're starting to send out mental health providers, social workers instead or alongside when something is happening, because every time it's too many lives lost, and we need to come together and figure out how we can solve this together. I know on our other call, Dave Stowe from Newtown Action Alliance said that the NSSF, which is a trade association for sporting associations, is actually more of a concern than the NRA. So I'm sharing that in the chat. Oh, Michelle, you have your hand up, please.
Thanks, I do, Holly. Good morning, everyone, and Abbey and Kimberly and Tarria, thank you so much for being here. Movi, who are the nonprofit behind the Why Do You Vote campaign and coffee chats, started in 2010 in response to the Supreme Court's horrific Citizens United decision. But 2 years prior to that, they had another disastrous ruling, which was the Heller decision, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, and that the Supreme Court had never recognized an individual's right to own a gun before 2008. And as much as there are things we can do locally on the ground and in coalition and all of this, we just are faced with this, devastatingly corrupt Supreme Court that seems to want us to live in this constant state of fear and grief and chaos. And I wonder if your organizations are looking through this particular lens, and do you have a Supreme Court strategy? Obviously they're trying to make it so that even, California can't have the gun laws that we've managed to pass. So I would just toss that up to the three of you and wonder how you're thinking about that.
Great question, Michelle. Abbey, yes.
Sorry. I hear you. It's in the climate that we are in. You have to be practical and also have an understanding about where we are, where we've come from, and where we are. But I think that there's power in the people, and in terms of yes, for legislative change and the possibility of perhaps expanding the court at some point, and then perhaps finding a way that a route that way. But I really feel like we're not really understanding as a society the dangers that we're just allowing because of a lack of responsibility. I mean, if you just think about safe storage for a minute, it's that would be a huge cultural change to change the data on this, just one particular, and how many lives would be changed, how many tragedies would be averted if if people start just locking up their firearms. So I you it can be very depressing thinking about like what the Supreme Court looks like right now, and where we can even see something like a background check on every gun sale couldn't pass after Sandy Hook. I stood in front of the TV. I heard what the decision. It's just mind-boggling, and it actually drove up gun sales. So, it's pretty bad. But I do think there is a groundswell of support for this issue like there never was before. Although, like, really, they've been saying that 74% of NRA members believe in common sense gun laws, like a background check. So it's really the leadership. Not that that's easy to dismantle, but I think there's power in the people and power in schools to really change the way we're looking at things, because we are very behind and we are putting our students and our families at risk. So we're focused on that, on like more of a cultural change. I would say that's probably fair to say.
Thank you.
And Tarria, do you want to share more about how your organization is doing their work?
Yeah, as in like the specifics of like our strategy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So currently, we handle our work. Again, we're a national organization. However, we have regional based advocacy associates, or advocacy experts who handle all of the advocacy efforts in their key states. So for instance, my key states is Maryland, New York, and New Jersey. We have individuals who are based in, Texas and, do work in Texas and Nevada and, things of that nature. Then we have a Southeast regional who does Georgia, North Carolina, and Louisiana. And we also have a Midwest associate as well. With that, just speaking from the work that I do just in my region, we connect with policymakers, we connect with organizers on the ground. We do a lot of coalition building. And in our coalitions, we bring in experts in all fields, right? So because we look at gun violence as a public health issue, instead of a criminal issue, I think that shifts the language and opens the door as far as the solutions that we're able to bring to the table. And we lead off our conversations with saying, we understand that although we are not putting police aside in this matter, we understand that we cannot arrest our way out of this matter, right? We have to offer other solutions, other ways to end the cycle of violence, because typically when police do come into the conversation, it's after the tragedy has already happened, right? We want to get there before the tragedy even happens. We want to prevent these tragedies from happening. That is our goal. And the only way to do so is to see it through a public health lens. And what do you do with public health issues? You do research. You maintain data. You add funding into it, right? You bring policymakers on board so that they can start, coming with like different policy and legislation and that sort of things. And for one example that I can give is in the state of Maryland. As I said, working alongside the governor's office has been amazing, right? Because I know in a lot of states that's not possible, right? But in Maryland, we were able to work with the governor's office to set up the first Center for Firearm Prevention and Intervention in the state of Maryland. Maryland has never had a statewide office. And, this year we were able to come out of this legislative session with a statewide office. That focuses on gun violence prevention. And then also coming out of this legislative session, we were able to pass the survivors or like the victims like relief fund, like that bill. The name is slipping my mind right now, but we were able to advocate for that and pass it. And what that bill does is it focuses on the survivors coming out of tragedy, right? We want to make sure, again, not only are we listening to them, but we're actually giving them support because that matters. Oftentimes when we see an issue that happens within our communities alone, especially in Black and Brown communities, it's typically a cycle of violence where someone may get injured, harmed, or killed with gun violence, and therefore that stirs up a whole nother cycle of violence. So we bring in public health officials, right? We bring in experts that do this research. We bring in individuals who are at the bedsides of those family members and those survivors, and having those conversations to the table because they're closest to what's happening. They can tell you what's needed there. They can tell you like, hey, we need mental health resources to these families so then that trauma doesn't sit with them. We need relocation, right? So that these individuals aren't staying in this very traumatic situation, right? We need youth services in these schools. We need community advocates that are actually in these communities, on these streets, as these kids are getting out of school, making sure that these kids are getting home safely, making sure that, if they do see anything ramping up as far as any argument or fight or whatever, they're right there able to de-escalate the situation before anything else goes, awry. So those are the sort of things that we back. Those are the sort of things that we support. Those are the sort of things that we advocate for. And we take this from a state to state to state basis across the country.
Thank you, Tarria. I'd love to now ask Kimberly. She shared that Lives Robbed recently teamed up with Community Justice. So can you share from being on the receiving end of this support and what that meant and looked like in your community?
Yeah, I would say Uvalde is very unique, not just for the failed response, but for the history of racism, a lack of trust in leadership, poverty, mental health resources are not there. It's not consistent. It's kind of a rotating cycle, and nobody's willing to relocate to Uvalde to stay on the ground to help these survivors and those individuals seeking therapy or counseling within the school district, because they're constantly having to fight, teachers leaving. Our counselors rotate. So, my son received counseling the first year. It's very hard for him to open up. So he really liked his counselor, and then she was moved to another district or another campus. So he just never felt comfortable after that and hasn't received help since. So those are some of the things that we're about battling, along with calling for accountability and transparency. All of the officers involved on May 24th are still employed. Only 4 lost their jobs, and they didn't lose their jobs. The school district just disbanded their police force. So they're still out in the community. That's who responds to calls. That's who you see at basketball games and at parades doing security. So it's a very difficult situation here. And I think this loss of security that the community faced just caused those that weren't directly impacted to villainize those that were, in a way to just sweep everything under the rug. We want to move on. We don't want to talk about this anymore. Our local newspaper has really, really taken some backlash for even just reporting updates. So it's difficult. It's difficult living here with all the reminders and with all of the issues that haven't been addressed.
Wow, thank you for sharing. And
Yeah.
is there a place where can we help support you? What's the best way to support your community?
Right now, hearing from the panel that we helped host with Community Justice, the library is a great place to start. They are up to date. They're trying to create a ROB archive so that there's history of the national and community response, and it is archived for anybody to go and see. They hold events for the children in the community. So definitely the newspaper, because they have also a Report for America. It's a grant. It's a small newspaper. Obviously, myself working there, it was very difficult for the reporters to both grieve and report. So this Report for America allowed this individual to come in from out of town to help report. But that's also something that requires funding. All newspapers are struggling, and if this one goes down, there will be nobody holding anybody accountable in Uvalde. And also to stay up to date, Lives Robbed, we post updates from there as well.
Okay, let's share those links. And I just started thinking, it's like so many people do therapy online. Like, I wonder if there's like a Doctors Without Borders for therapists that would be willing to donate their time to serve your community. I mean, and all of the communities. I don't know if that exists, but it
I'm
just
not sure. I'm not sure on that one. I can speak a little to what I've heard from other people. I myself haven't sought therapy yet, so I haven't had a firsthand experience, but some of the other parents that I'm close with have, and that's one of the issues that they've discussed is not having somebody that stays. You know, they sat with someone for a month and then they're gone the next month, and here's this next individual, and that's a great idea. That's something definitely to look into.
yeah, because now we could be doing it. You could have the one person who could stay, but they still can live where they live, but support. Maybe that's something we can try to manifest. And is there a link for any like I guess I can look up and try to share later in
No, I
there.
was just sending the names.
Yeah, we'll try to put links here and where people could support, because I know I would like to help support that effort.
And with that, I do have to leave. I have a work related at noon. So thank y'all so much for your
Thank
time.
you so
Yeah,
much.
thank you. We've
Thank
really
you,
been
Kimberly.
great.
Bye.
Yeah. Mhm.
I was wondering also, Abby, when I had my 3 kids in England where this is not an issue because there aren't any guns. And so coming here to Los Angeles, when we first relocated, there was a lot of gang violence. And so it was don't go in this neighborhood or that neighborhood. And there was a great campaign. At that time, it was before we had digital devices to use for this, but or apps. There were cell phones, but not all these apps. We had like I think it was MTV Advocacy did a campaign that was if your child is going to go have a play date or go over someone's house, even if like mine were teenagers, here's a list of questions to ask and how to ask them. If you have a gun, is it locked up? And it was very effective at that time. I don't know what happened to that afterwards, and that was before all the school shootings. But I think a campaign like that and somebody developing something that someone could have on their phone, so it becomes the norm. And it reminds people, hey, make sure you have everything locked. If you have a gun, it should be locked up with a combination that's up high that children can't get to, because that was the number one cause of death was accidental of kids just playing with them, of childhood mortality. And so I think if we kind of look for some new advocacy towards that, and because then the people are taking control, not just our elected representatives, but kind of make it part of our conversation, which is an uncomfortable thing to ask somebody, hey, do you have a gun in your house? But I think we have to make it normalize that.
You're totally right. And there actually are really some great campaigns there's one called Be Smart, and it's through Moms Demand Action. And it has an acronym for each one of the letters. And it's their nonpartisan campaign. And they go into communities and do presentations at libraries and at schools. They even have some schools that are on board where the school sends out the materials, and it's about that very thing and having those conversations. And I know the Brady campaign has been working on this for years, and I don't know what, well, we know why it's uncomfortable, but like you ask if you're sending your kid on a play date, you would say, oh, well, my kid can't have peanut butter, so can you make sure that you keep the peanut butter? Like they, and why it's offensive to ask, and there are parent like groups that help each other share some ideas on what you can say. And if you do it by text, then it might not be as scary. But you're right. And I think just that piece, just asking and normalizing something like that is really is changing the culture. I mean, I remember even asking, it was after the tragedy, asking before I sent my kid on a play date, asking the parent, and I remember, and they've known me for years. And it was they got so offended that the dad answered the phone, is ex-military. I don't know what the problem, you would think that it would just be normalized, especially a lot of military families do lock up their guns more so than civilian families, right? And he got so mad that he couldn't talk to me. He handed to his wife to talk to me. And I was like, I'm just want my kid to be safe. So we have a lot of work to do in that area, and but I do know there are really good campaigns out there. But I also feel like Teachers Unify should work on that too, especially as a school and you're talking to parents all the time. A lot of times we disseminate this kind of information. It's just hard for teachers to feel like they're allowed to say things.
And maybe all the PTAs. I mean,
and the PTAs, and the National PTA. They are on board with gun violence prevention. They are concerned about it. They invited us to their conference this past year, which is huge. And we're hoping to continue that relationship. So these are one campaign we could definitely work together with them on. Thank you. I'm gonna start that, Nancy. Thank you.
Thank you. I love how we come to collaborate and learn more. I mean, I remember there was somebody trying to break into my condo, and I told my neighbor later, he's like, why didn't you call me? I have a gun. And I was like, I actually felt more scared knowing, because I know the incidents of accidents with guns. It actually made me more like, I don't know, I just didn't like living, one wall away from a gun. It's and I'm sharing in the chat on our first sensible gun law, we had Heidi Human from Behind the Bullet. Her film showed 4 people who've pulled the trigger on guns and how it's affected them. And she went through with the idea of like, they say, oh, just arm more people. But what does that really look like? That doesn't make us safer. We see here with our country statistics that we are the least safe because we have more. So that's a really beautiful film you might want to check out. Yeah, and just bringing this conversation to the public sphere. Again, we are a social media action campaign. This is the hardest one to ask people to make videos for. We do have our Spark the Vote social media and film challenge, but because this is such a sensitive topic and the haters who come out on social media, it's real. So when people, if they are choosing to make videos about public safety, I would almost encourage having the comments off, because I've seen even things like I posted about how many people I knew had been immediately affected by gun violence. They're like, oh, she's lying. She doesn't know that many people. It's like, yes, it's shocking. But they're the minority. But if anybody does, bringing this conversation to the public sphere, bringing it to local, state, and federal, speaking up, using our voices, working together across, the partisan divide. We are a nonpartisan campaign, and most people agree on this. Actually, it'd be great to get a Hunters for Sensible Gun Laws group together, because they exist. Getting more and more voices together to create the future where we are all safer.
Can I share something that just happened that you guys have all given me, gals particularly? Um, I have I've been involved in metaphysics and spirituality for 50 years. So that is my passion. That is my not only my passion, but my contribution to the world. And I work with the future. And thank you so much, Michelle, for introducing me to Holly and then inviting me here. I just had an insight that I have not had in 40 years of working with the future that is just making me so excited about life. I have a daughter who's 30. I have granddaughters who are 3. I'm passionate about life and love and the future. And I also grew up in Utah and Montana, and I grew up in a log cabin in the mountains, the woods. So I grew up with guns. I have guns. It's just I'm normal. I have tools to work on my motorcycle, and I have guns, and I have a metaphysical, spiritual passion for life. And you just gave me, thank you so much, Michelle. This is an insight I never. Buckminster Fuller was a genius on the scale of Einstein. Like Einstein was impressed by Buckminster Fuller when he met him. He created the geodesic dome back in the 1950s, and he was also a Renaissance man. And Buckminster Fuller's passion, he almost killed himself because he was so miserable. He walked into the river or one of the Great Lakes and was going to kill himself. But then he heard a voice say, "Your life is not your own. You belong to humanity." And he didn't kill himself, walked back out and created just all kinds of amazing things, impressed Einstein. And his goal, his passion, which touched me 40 years ago when I read about it, and then I worked with a guy who was actually a colleague of his. Buckminster Fuller's vision was make the world work for 100% of humanity in the shortest possible time through spontaneous cooperation without ecological offense or the disadvantage of anyone. So his way to solve problems was to create a solution that was so attractive, that was so seductive, that was so compelling that the problem became obsolete. So I've been playing with that for years and years and years. I saved my own life. I got mugged 50 years ago by 2 drug addicts and had a gun at the base of my skull. And one was saying, "Shoot him, shoot him, shoot him." And I magically created my way out of that. And 5 years later, I was suicidal and I was going to take my own guns. And my gun violence was I was going to shoot myself because I was just hopeless. I hated life. It was like I couldn't stand. My marriage fell apart. My life fell apart. My career. It was just, I'm out of here. And the thing that saved me was creating a better future. I chose a better future. And now what I've seen, I showed this to you a couple of weeks ago when I was, this is a chart from u.gov from, I don't know, 2017 or something. The red is the way people in all different countries feel about the future of the world. And the red is people who think the world is stuck or getting worse. The blue over here, which in the United States is 6%, feel that the world is getting better. These people are really fucking angry. That's what I was when I couldn't see my life getting better. It almost killed me. And Buckminster Fuller, in the lead into his book, Critical Path, he said he went and surveyed the whole world because we've been taught since Thomas Malthus in the 1600s said humanity can't survive. We're going to fail. And Bucky Fuller reviewed the whole world. And he said, wait, no, we now have mechanized farming. We now have technology. And he said, the world can work for 100% of humanity. And we have enough resources for every person to live like a billionaire. We already live like millionaires because each one of our phones is worth $1 million. As of like 30 or 40 years ago, it would cost you $1 million for this. We already live like millionaires. He said the whole world can work and we can live like billionaires. And because of you, thank you, Michelle, because of just thinking about this and all of you caring so much about humanity, society, I just realized that if we create a future where the world works for everyone, not only do individuals live with a sense of wealth and abundance like billionaires, but we would have the resources to do programs to help people with mental problems. We'd have the resources to solve the economic issues. The book Abundance by Peter Diamandis talks about how we already have the resources to solve every problem in humanity. It's just that, so that the most important line that I want to complete with, in the foreword, he said, we have enough resources for everyone to live like a billionaire. In other words, we can win the game of life as human beings. But the next line is the one that is, I think, caused the violence that almost killed me, the violence in the world of the anger. He said, we can live like billionaires. The problem is 99% of the population do not know that. I work a lot with people from 8 to 80. I work a lot with teenagers, and they are so hopeless about the future, and they are so angry. And that's what I see. The anger is what causes the violence in all forms, whether it's suicide, whether it's drugs, alcohol, guns. And 90%, over 95% of the population cannot see a bright future. But what you just gave me, thank you so much, Michelle. I had listened to Bucky's quote that we can individually live in abundance. I thought, oh, great. I have a nice house. I have a nice life. I never until today put together that living in true abundance means society has all the resources we need to support kids, to help mothers, to make people feel safe and loved so they don't want to hurt other people. So what I recommend, what I do for myself and what I did with my daughter yesterday, I was helping her visualize a future where the world works for everyone. Because in that world, people wouldn't want to kill each other. Teens wouldn't want to kill themselves. The world can work for 100% of humanity. And that's the ultimate. And I've never seen that spreading beyond the individual person to society until this conversation. Thank you so much, Michelle and Holly and Abbey. You're caring for humanity opened my heart, which then opened my mind. And I feel more hopeful about the future of the world than I ever have. And I thank you for that.
Ah, yes. Thank you, Ty.
Thank you, Ty.
Quite a statement. Yes, alienation, not the feeling of not belonging. I mean, we see this again and again in the acts of the mass shooters, or so many. It is a huge.
Even the mothers that kill their kids because they're usually oppressed and when they interview them, they say, I couldn't imagine having my kids grow up in the future of this world.
Right.
The world is so dark that they take themselves and their kids out. If we had a bright future, and I feel more hopeful about the future because of all you. And that's what I do. Like, I'm the world's #1 expert in this stuff. And you just added to my future.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Well, I mean, one of the ways in which we saw this manifest this summer was the, doom and gloom of facing the November election. And
Right.
in an instant, it was a completely different reality. Right. And suddenly, there was hope, there were smiles, and optimism.
Yes. The feminine energy, the goddess is returning. It's such a powerful energy. Of Kamala Harris.
Right. It's a very, and optimism is a wonderful energy to work with and can bring in so many benefits to our society. Thank you.
With that, we are at the top of the hour. So I just so appreciate today's call and everybody here taking the time. And I hope that this conversation helps move the needle to more sensible future with, saving, preventing this madness.
The gift I gave to my daughter, let me just add one thing. The gift I gave to my daughter yesterday was helping. She has 2 3-year-olds now. And I helped her see a future where her 3-year-olds grow up in a happy world. You can do it work on your own future. Each one of us is powerful. Imagine your own awesome future where Bucky's future, where the world works for 100% of humanity. I still have difficulty imagining that. I've been working on it for 45 years. So imagine that, because it starts with a dream. And now it's happening with Kamala and the whole world changing. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, thank you once again, everyone. This Tuesday chat was brought to you by Money Out, Voters In, and it's a nonprofit, nonpartisan campaign. And we look forward to having you join us, hopefully, next week. Thank you.
Yeah. Next week's going to be a barn burner. Join us. All right.